Meanwhile, in the first 18 months of Labor, personal income tax has risen by a record 27%. However, the purchasing power of an Australian earning a gross salary of $85,000 has fallen by more than $7,000. It's fallen by $7,600 since Labor came to office, and Labor has got no answers as to how to address this.
The member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. My word is my bond. So said Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. He looked Australians in the eye and knowingly and repeatedly misled them, up to about 100 times, in fact. This Prime Minister has committed a breach of trust on a scale not seen since Julia Gillard's infamous "there will be no carbon tax under the government I lead." And Australians, Deputy Speaker, will not forget this. Deputy Speaker, the Treasury Laws Amendment Bill reflects— there are three things I want to say about the Treasury Laws Amendment Bill. Number one, it is a gross breach of promise, a breach of trust with the Australian people. Secondly, it leaves out to dry a great majority of Australians, and they are Australians who are earning an income between $130,000 and $190,000 a year. And while these are income levels that are significantly above the national Australian income level, many of these people reside in my electorate. Indeed, in order to purchase a home in my electorate, they need to be on an income of between those levels. These are the Australians that the Prime Minister and the Labor government, those on the other side, have completely let down with this process. And thirdly, Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister and Treasurer Chalmers have missed an opportunity here to deliver and to continue to deliver real tax reform that was started under the former coalition government. And, Deputy Speaker, when we turn to broken promises, if the Prime Minister can mislead Australia so blatantly, how can anyone ever believe anything he says ever again? How can we trust that when he says that he will make no changes to negative gearing, that there'll be no changes to the tax treatment on the family home, that he won't jump into bed again with the Greens and look at pursuing some of their tax reform ideas, such as a wealth tax, an inheritance tax? How can Australians ever believe a word that the Prime Minister says? Because this broken promise about the Stage 3 tax cuts, it's about the Prime Minister's political future. It's not about the long-term benefits for Australians. It's not about the long-term benefits of reforming our taxation system and bringing about secure and firm economic management. And we're aware now that the government asked Treasury to look at options, including revising Stage 3, as early as the 11th of December last year. But following that, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer continued to state on at least a dozen times that they hadn't changed their position on Stage 3. And this was legislation that both Anthony Albanese and Treasurer Jim Chalmers both voted for in the previous parliament. If they are so committed to changing their position, why wouldn't they have simply come to Australians and said, "We've changed our mind, and this is why"? Instead, "my word is my bond" continued to be the mantra. So, Deputy Speaker, this is nothing but a political response from the government. It's not a proper cost of living response. It's obvious from these changes that the Prime Minister and Treasurer aren't serious about Australia's long-term economic prosperity. All they care about is politics, not genuine tax reform and long-term prosperity. And we can clearly see that when we also know that there is the Dunkley by-election coming up, and the Treasurer, of course, gave that train wreck interview on Monday night where he confirmed that the government didn't want to wait until after the Dunkley by-election to announce changes. So these changes have been brought in simply to shore up a by-election and not in the long-term interests of the Australian economy. Deputy Speaker. And remarkably, the Prime Minister this morning was calling on the Coalition to vote against his own bill. Absolutely remarkable. Short-term political tactics aimed at wedging those of us on this side rather than looking at genuine economic reform. But Australians are smart. Australians can see right through this sort of politicking. And meanwhile, there are thousands of Australians who will now be worse off without the 37-cent tax rate disappearing from our taxation system. And that will be not just in the short term, not just after the 1st of July, but this will be going into the future, Deputy Speaker, as we see more and more Australians will be impacted by bracket creep. But this is again reflective of this government's economic mismanagement. And we've seen this in the cut to Australians' living standards by at least 8.6%. That's $8,000 a year, Deputy Speaker, that Australians used to have that they now don't have. $160 a week. And if you have a mortgage, it's even worse. Average mortgage holders in Australia are now paying $24,000 to $30,000 more a year than they were under the Coalition government. That's at least $500 per week in take-home pay. This is not sustainable for these people. The average renter is now paying $100 more per week than they were paying under the Coalition government. And, Deputy Speaker, these increases in housing costs are all attributable to economic mismanagement. It's a failure by the Prime Minister and the Treasurer to rein in inflation, which has led to 12 consecutive interest rate rises. And this is what is really impacting Australians with their housing costs. So, Deputy Speaker, we've seen Australians, we have heard on this side, we have heard Australians in our electorates crying out for 18 months for help with cost of living. Yet this only seemed to occur to the Prime Minister and the Treasurer over summer, that Australians are at a cost of living crisis. We've now got the Dunkley by-election coming up, so suddenly they are masquerading that they are delivering real tax reform. The Coalition will be supporting these laws, and that's on the basis that we are committed to lower, simpler and fairer taxes. That's why we won't oppose the reduction in the 19-cent tax rate to 16 cents, for example. It's why, in the first place, we brought in a suite of tax reform. We brought in Stage 1 and Stage 2 that were committed and showed our commitment to reducing income tax for Australians on low and middle incomes. Stage 3 was intended then to address those Australians on higher incomes. And many of these Australians earning between $130,000 and $190,000, and while that is an income that is significantly above the average Australian wage of $85,000 per year, these people have been forgotten by this government. And many of these people, in my electorate, for example, they need an income of that amount to be able to pay their rent or to be able to pay a mortgage in that electorate, and that is the same for many who live in our cities throughout Australia, whether that be Sydney or down in Melbourne or in Brisbane. But so the Coalition, Deputy Speaker, as we move into the election, the Coalition will demonstrate that it is still committed to real tax reform, to real proper economic management. We will be going to the election with a tax reform package in keeping with these Stage 3 tax reforms and worse, and more, because they were good reforms. They were good reforms. They removed the 37-cent tax bracket, demonstrating our commitment to fighting bracket creep and enshrining aspiration for Australians. As a matter of fact, these reforms were so good that those on that side voted for them when they came in. And our package, therefore, will deliver lower, simpler and fairer taxes, Deputy Speaker. We will fight bracket creep and enshrine aspiration into our tax system. We will reward hard work and support a strong economy where every Australian can get ahead. We will unite Australians through a tax policy, rather than pitting Australians against each other, rather than trying to bring in the cultural wars and the income wars of the class wars of the past. Our package will be delivered while providing for Australia's future security and guaranteeing the essential services that Australians rely upon. Before we go to the election, the package will be fully costed and ready to implement when we are elected. Most importantly, Deputy Speaker, we will keep our promises. Our word will be our bond. So when we turn to the provisions of the bill, Deputy Speaker, we see that it's made several changes to the already legislated Stage 3 tax cuts, but as I said, particularly it has not removed the 37-cent tax rate, which was vital for us to look at addressing long-term bracket creep.
Thank you. And the debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 43. The debate may be resumed at a later hour, and if the member's speech was interrupted, you'll be granted leave when the debate is resumed.
The honourable member for Hughes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so the actual provisions of this bill are that and this was the bill to the legislated Stage 3 tax cuts, that the 18,000 to 45,000 threshold is reduced from 19 cents to 16 cents. The flat 45 to 200,000 threshold, taxed at 30 cents in the dollar, is now split into two, where $45,000 to $135,000 is at 30 cents, and $135,000 to $190,000 will be at 37 cents. And this was the 37-cent tax rate, Mr. Speaker, that was the subject of the Coalition's very sensible Stage 3 tax cut legislation. And the government has claimed, Labor has claimed, this will be broadly revenue neutral. However, Treasury has said the measure will cost at least an extra $1.3 billion over the next 4 years, while over the medium term the measure will increase tax receipts by $28 billion over the next decade. This, in effect, means that this will make a lot of our taxpayers going into the future significantly worse off with bracket creep, and the fact that the government has not addressed this has just shown yet again that since coming to office, the Prime Minister, the government, has made the wrong decisions. They've been very distracted by other matters and also have been breaking promises at every opportunity. Meanwhile, in the first 18 months of Labor, personal income tax has risen by a record 27%. However, the purchasing power of an Australian earning a gross salary of $85,000 has fallen by more than $7,000. It's fallen by $7,600 since Labor came to office, and Labor has got no answers as to how to address this. This is a symptom of economic mismanagement, where we still see headline inflation remaining far too high, much higher than most of our other OECD countries and our competitors. So when I turn now, one of the other objections about this legislation was, of course, that this was another broken promise of this Prime Minister and this government. And just to reiterate, some of those promises that were made before the election and after the election were that there would be a 275 reduction in energy prices. Broken promise. There would be no change to super taxes. Broken promise. There would be an increase in real wages. Broken promise. There will be no changes to franking credits. Broken promise. You will all have cheaper mortgages. All Australians will have cheaper mortgages, said the Prime Minister during the election campaign. Broken promise. Let's tell that to the average mortgage holder. The average mortgage holder in my electorate of Hughes, for example, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who is now paying $25,000 a year more, $500 a week in after-tax income that they now have to find to pay their mortgage. There will be no changes to Stage 3 tax cuts, said the Prime Minister. My word is my bond. Another broken promise. So Deputy Speaker, while it is the case that the Coalition will support this legislation because we are a party that is committed to lower taxes, we are committed to smaller government and smaller regulation, what is important here is that Australians are now seeing this Prime Minister cannot be trusted. His repetitive oath, "This is my word is my bond," further broken promises means that he has broken trust with the Australian people. Thank you.